It's The Law with Morelli Churtko, and joining me is Karen Scheinman Martin, whose area of practice is personal injury, estate litigation, civil litigation. And the question today is, do deer, yes, the cute little deer who can do a lot of damage to your vehicle apparently, do they carry insurance? So right off the top, do they?
No.
Oh, they don't. Okay, I was wondering about that. But we want to know if you can sue if you've been injured in an accident with a deer.
And the short answer is no.
Okay.
The explanation for that is quite simple. To sue, somebody has to do something wrong, and you sue them. In the case of deer, they don't carry insurance, so you can't sue them. So therefore, you don't get any compensation for your injuries. You can't sue anybody. Many people ask if ICBC is the one that you can sue, and the answer is also no, because ICBC isn't directing the deer.
Okay.
And they don't have a contract with the deer. So now you're stuck. What ICBC will do is, if you have comprehensive coverage, they will then pay for the repairs of your vehicle minus your deductible. And they'll also pay for some of your medical expenses, which I'll go into a little bit later. Now, if you're in a situation where you have a passenger and you've been speeding or doing something else that could be seen as negligent, and you hit the deer, then the passenger can sue you because you have done something negligent or wrong. And then they can get compensation from your insurance.
What if the driver wasn't speeding and hits the deer?
Then there's no negligence, and the passenger is in that same situation as the driver, where if the driver hasn't done anything wrong or negligent, there's no reason to sue them.
Okay.
Well, you can try, but you won't succeed.
What if the deer is drunk? No, we won't get into that. Okay, so you can't sue ICBC. What type of compensation can you receive?
You can receive compensation covered under what's referred to commonly as Part 7. Now, those are regulations from the Insurance Vehicle Act. And if you want, anybody can go on to the website of bclaws.ca, look for insurance vehicle, and then click on that and click on the regulations and look for Part 7s, and that would outline what you're entitled to. In a nutshell, you're entitled to have your medical paid for up to a reasonable limit. So all the hospital visits and some of the physiotherapy, chiropractor, and all of that will be paid. And I say some because the regulations outline limits as to what ICBC is obligated to pay. And you can also get some compensation for lost wages, up to $300 a week. Now, there's a whole lot of restrictions on that, and it's best to go to, in fact, the regulations say that you're supposed to go to another insurer first if you have access to that. And when I say 300, it's up to 300. It's 75% of your lost wages, up to the maximum of 300, and it's for 104 weeks as a maximum, or whatever it takes for you to get back to work. And again, the regulations say deal with some caveats if it takes longer than 104 weeks to recover. The regulations will deal with the circumstances upon which they will extend that. But the regulations deal with specific requirements that ICBC has for which they will extend the amount of time which you would receive the compensation for being out of work.
You do hear quite often of people striking wildlife, and I imagine with a deer it's also the same if it's a moose, if it's a badger, if it's whatever the case may be. But is it quite common?
Yes, it is, particularly in our area. We get calls, or at least I get calls typically about at least once or twice a year with people wanting to basically sue ICBC because they've hit a deer. It's simply a case of people don't know. So it is fairly common.
Don't want to get into too much detail, but is it mostly damage to the vehicle? Is it mostly vehicles, or is it often bodily injury as well?
It's usually a combination of both. It depends upon the type of vehicle, of course, that they're driving. There's always vehicular damage, which is taken care of, minus the deductible. But when we get the calls, it's because they've got some other actual physical injuries as a result of the impact.
Okay, Karen, I know you may want to get into a little more detail as far as the regulations are concerned.
Well, whenever you can't sue somebody, or even if you can, you have access to what's called Part 7, as I mentioned before, and that's carried on your own insurance. When I mentioned about what you can receive, I do want to stress that ICBC is the secondary payer when it comes to, for instance, disability insurance. So if you do have a primary source, you should go through them first. And then what happens is if they pay, for instance, only 55% of your wages, ICBC will top it up to the 75% mark, but again, up to a maximum of $300 a week. So there are a lot of limits in that respect. They also do cover, for instance, death benefits, but they only pay about $2,500 for funeral costs. Many might say are sort of outdated. Now, if, for instance, there is the deer hits the motorcyclist and the motorcyclist doesn't survive, along with death benefits, ICBC will, under Part 7, also pay some compensation to a widow or to a child who is a dependent, and they have to be dependents. But those are limited amounts. It's not the same as if a car hit the motorcyclist. If there is somebody that you can sue, obviously you'd get a far higher amount of compensation.
All right, Karen, if I was to hit a deer, or if someone else who's listening was to hit a deer or some wildlife, should they call ICBC first? Should they call a lawyer? What's the best plan of attack?
They should definitely call ICBC. There's not really much that a lawyer can do to help them.
Mm-hmm.
It's a matter for ICBC to deal with. Particularly if the deer is still alive, you should really call the police.
Right.
Or conservation officer.
All right. Well, thank you so much for shedding some light on what happens all too often, especially in South Central BC, and appreciate you coming in.
Thank you.
It's The Law, Morelli Church Co. and Karen Shyman Martin.